Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phones. The Eudora Welty House and Garden, in partnership with the Eudora Welty Foundation, will host its annual heirloom plant sale this Saturday, March 26th. You can buy plants propagated from ones in the Welty Garden, plus hard-to-find varieties grown there, including native azaleas, old-fashioned camellias, and heirloom varieties of flowering perennials. Sales begin at 9 a.m. and will continue until the plants are gone. This year, MDAH and the Mississippi Museum of Art are partnering on an initiative examining the Great Migration and its impact on Mississippi and the nation. MDAH is offering fellowships to people to research their family's connection to Mississippi at the state archives, gathering oral histories, and holding a series of public programs. In April, the Museum of Art will open the exhibition A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration, which will present newly commissioned work by 12 of the nation's foremost visual artists. I hope you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when we'll have Museum of Art Director Betsy Bradley and Chief Curator Ryan Dennis to preview that exhibition. Today, we are delighted to have George Milne to present Mississippi's first urban landscape. As we had noted last week, George was originally scheduled for spring of 2020. Hello, worldwide pandemic. Then rescheduled for the fall of 2021. Oops, Delta variant. So I was not surprised that on the day of his flight into Jackson, there were 100-mile-per-hour winds and tornadoes in the metro area. Hospitality state indeed. George Milne teaches early U.S. history at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. He earned his M.A. in U.S. history from New York University and his Ph.D. in U.S. history from the University of Oklahoma. Milne has written entries for the Encyclopedia of American History and the Encyclopedia of Native American History, published articles in Ethnohistory and William and Mary Quarterly, and authored a chapter in the book Religion, Space, and the Atlantic World, edited by John Corrigan. His first book, Natchez Country, Indians, Colonists, and the Landscapes of Race in French Louisiana, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2015. Help me welcome George Milne.
Just obviously my mic is on. There were some tornadoes and a bumpy ride here, but I have to say, since I landed, Mississippi has been a very gracious host, and I am really happy. This is my first trip by airplane since the pandemic, and I'm glad I'm in the South again, and I'm looking forward to some real Southern cooking. It's a little bit difficult to find in Detroit. So it's not impossible, but it's difficult. What I'd like to do is talk about Natchez, Mississippi, as an urban landscape. So the talk is structured in a way that might be a little different. Originally, I thought, well, this will be easy. I spent about 8 or 10 years researching the book, going to France, going to different places throughout the Western Hemisphere, looking for sources, and gee, I really know this story. But through some, let's say, absent-minded professor antics of mine, I tried to go back and find the original computer documents or the computer files. And I was very proud of myself last month of having thrown out about at least a half a dozen old hard drives. Yes, you got it. But what that did was, Chris has been so generous, and the Department of Archives and History has been so generous. I decided, well, let me revisit this. Let me do this again, and I'll tell you a little story behind this. I started on this project, the book project, using something called GIS software, Geographic Information System Software. And I had no idea how it worked. I had gone to a conference in Tallahassee at the University of Florida, and I was introduced to this software, and I was, well, this is nice, but how's this going to work for me? And I got to a point where I could use it enough to illustrate a book project. And I was pretty happy with the maps that I created, but I was only using it as a visualizing tool. Fast forward about 7 or 8 years, I had become obsessed with this software and how can a historian use that? And that's what I want you to see in operation in this talk. So I decided, I'm going to go and take some classes on how to use this software. Now, I think you can tell by the color of my hair, it's Arctic blonde, that I'm not a traditional student. And I'm tenured, I'm a professor. I have a PhD. But I sat in the class, and of course, one of the instructors said, well, Dr. Milne. I said, no, I'm George. I am another student. And I took the course as another student. Now, the introductory course, bam, knocked it out. It was no problem. But I took an advanced course with seniors and entry-level master's students. And boy, did I learn about being an instructor, because I got to a point in that particular course where it was time to take the midterm. And I started sweating about the midterm. And I started staying up at night. And to make a long story short, I took the midterm. I had just about set up one of the first problems. Of course, it's all done on computer. Set up the first problem, got the data, was ready to process it. And one of my students, well, not my student, one of the students got up and left, handed in her work. She's out the door. Then another one. Then another one. And, well, I wound up getting a B in a course. Now, I have not gotten a B in a course since Jimmy Carter was president. And I grabbed the instructor. I said, David, I think there's a problem with this grade. I have a feeling this is a case of grade inflation. You're just trying to brown-nose me. He said, no, George, you got an 85. You are right in the middle of a B. So what that did was it did two things. I learned what GIS can do, and I'm going to share that with you in this talk. And the other thing is, it made me a heck of a better professor, because I started looking at my students in a very different way, and say, they're sweating over this. This means something to their career. This means something to their life. Take it seriously, George. These are students who are really engaged. They could be doing something else, and they're sitting in your class. And I can't tell you what a privilege it is to teach, to be a teacher, to do that, to share information, not just information, but a way of looking at the world. And that's what I want to do here, is show you some different ways of looking at things. Now, as I said, this came from my book project. I haven't touched this book in a while. After I got it published and a year or two went by and I read all of the reviews, and most of them were quite generous, that I didn't want to hear about the Natchez ever again. I have been living, breathing, French documents. I started dreaming in French, and I can't speak it very well, but boy, when it comes to some of those documents, I know them inside and out. So I thought of repackaging my book talk and just giving it here, but because of that disposal of so many hard drives, and by the way, I burnt out the computer that had all of the data, doing exactly what I'm going to do here. So this is a brand new computer. I bought it for this talk. So I started going through my manuscript, and I said, these people are inviting me to come more than 1,000 miles to give a talk. Let's give them a good talk. Let's do something different. Let's go back. And I rebuilt my entire database. So I'm going to show you that, and I really want you to challenge me. I want you to ask the hard questions. Chris said that you're all very generous, that you're not going to play stump the professor, and I want you to stump the professor, because if you push me to a question that I can't answer, you're going to make me a better scholar. So, of course, my talk focuses on Natchez Country, which we can see on the map. This is one of the early versions of GIS when I was just learning to use the software, and it certainly does the job. And remember that a map is a story. Maps can tell a story, and in fact, I'll be teaching a course on cartography, and one of the first books that I will assign is called How to Lie with Maps, because maps can be very deceptive. And today, you're all seeing maps of southeastern Europe, of the Ukraine and the various invasions. These are all done with the same software. So now I look at these CNN or Fox News or any of the other reporting networks, and I can see the code. I feel like, Neo in the Matrix. I see what's behind, I can see behind the veil. And that's what I want to do here, is give you an opportunity to look behind the veil. So who are the Natchez? The Natchez were a Mississippian chieftain. And that's a term that anthropologists use for a broad swath of cultures that existed at least as far back as 900 years after the Common Era, 900 years AD, to the 1730s. And in fact, the last really intact Mississippian chiefdom were the Natchez. And just to review what a Mississippian chiefdom was, we can see here, this is an artist's rendition of Cahokia, of Monk's Mound in present-day Illinois, right across the river. It's in East St. Louis, right across the river from St. Louis, Missouri. And it's famous for its rather striking mound structures. And there are dozens of them. In fact, maybe we're really not sure. And you can see all of these little huts. And this is one of the good illustration when I teach Native American history. This is one of the things where I can say, the jury's always out when it comes to historical judgments, because there are arguments to this day about how many people lived in Cahokia in roughly 1400, its fluorescence, its high point. And some scholars will say, well, as many as 4,000 people, which makes it a fairly good-sized town for the 1400s. Others will say as many as 30,000. And that wide discrepancy has to do with how the archaeologists count the post holes that held up all of these little structures. All we have left are the holes in the ground. And by the way, that is one of the most permanent things humans make. If you put a hole in the ground, it is probably one of the easiest things for archaeologists to detect once they pull back the surface. Anyway, the Mississippian chiefdoms are noted for their hierarchy, their social hierarchy. So in come the Europeans, starting with De Soto, and they meet these rather hierarchical societies. We tend to think of Native peoples as sort of egalitarian, as nomadic, but that's not the case. These were urban dwellers. These people lived in towns that were fairly substantial by the era standards. So if we think of the 1400s, we think of towns, if there are as many as 30,000 people in Cahokia, that puts it on the level of a fairly good-sized town in France or Germany at the same era. It's not quite London, it's not quite Paris, but it certainly would have been Manchester, or it certainly would have been Toulon, or Orléans, or Granada. It would have been a big center of culture. So we have these hierarchical structures, and here we have a 20th century illustration, and this is a priest or a chief. Sometimes the Europeans saw them, they called them kings or emperors. Other times they called them half-kings. In other cases, they would call them chiefs. And they had both a political and a spiritual role in their societies. And as I said, here's another version of Cahokia, and we can see that there are rather elaborate structures. These mound structures exist today. A lot of the mound structures were actually destroyed during the 19th century throughout the southeast because they held such rich soil. So a lot of them were blown up, they were dynamited, or they were plowed under. In other cases, they were plundered by treasure hunters. And so to this day, there are federal and state laws to prevent that this day. And if you're looking for an archaeological site, somebody like me, you sort of have to know the secret handshake because the state governments are very reluctant to let their locations be known once they're plotted because people will come and look for arrowheads and otherwise disturb the archaeological record. But these elaborate pictures that we develop, a lot of what we use, and I mean we by academics, to reconstruct these visions comes from the Natchez, from what the French wrote down when they encountered the Natchez Indians. So we see this gentleman here, and it looks like he and his retinue are gesturing to the sky, more than likely to some sun deity, or at least that's what Europeans interpreted it as. So, in fact, it comes from that rendition, that image is a more elaborate expression of this simpler woodcut of the great sun, the transport of the great sun of the Natchez, le grand soleil. And we can see he's being carried on a leader, very much like European nobility. And part of what I try and get across in my book is that Native Americans look at Europeans and say, well, they're hierarchical like us. And they look at, the Europeans look back at the Native Americans and say, well, they're hierarchical like us. These Natchez, they have a nobility, a noble class. They have a leader, an absolute leader, the great sun. At the time, that is what the Louis XIV called himself. He called himself the Sun King. So these are, very ephemeral. They're very superficial similarities, but they're enough where people can look across that cultural divide and say, they're not so different. Maybe we can work together. So these memoirs are really important, and this comes from a memoir by a man named Lepage-Duprat. And if we go over to the archives, I guarantee you can find versions of his history of Louisiana, Histoire de la Louisiane. These Mississippian cultures tended to be, we also call them complex chiefdoms because they're not just one site. So Cahokia had many satellite towns and villages, and they paid taxes. They paid taxes in the form of corn, in the form of skins, in the form of precious goods like best cuts of meat, sometimes some rare and unusual items that came as far away as Mexico or Michigan, pieces of copper that came from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, or coral that might have come from California, or feathers, parrot feathers and parrots that might have come up through trade routes through Mexico, through the Sonoran Desert into Texas, and as far as Alabama. So there are these very elaborate trade networks, and there are elaborate social and political ties holding these small urban settlements around a larger settlement, usually called the paramount chiefdom. And that is where the great sun, the paramount chief, would reside. And in return, that paramount chief would redistribute various goods. They'd redistribute food in time of need. And if you really want to understand it, you can go to two different sources. Take a look at the book of Genesis and think about Joseph. And think about how when Joseph was appointed by the Pharaoh to take charge of the Pharaoh's granaries. They gathered in all of the food, and during the 7 years of famine, Joseph was able to release the food. In return, the people who received the food had to give up more and more of their autonomy until they became, in the book of Genesis, they're called slaves. They're definitely at the behest. They are subordinate to the political structure. And if you notice, there's no mention of money at that point. It's all trade goods. The other thing you can look at, if you want to understand these Mississippian chieftains, I met an anthropologist named Alice Keogh. And if you ever watched, she was one of those people who was about 4 feet tall, but, a real dynamo. And she was, anthropologists can be a little esoteric, let's say. And she said in one of her talks that if you want to understand these Mississippian chieftains, take a look at the Shakespearean histories. Look at Macbeth. There's always interfamilial fratricide. There's patricide, fratricide. They're killing each other over succession. Who's going to be the next king? There's no clear succession. So these Mississippian chieftains generally don't last more than a few generations because the issue is who's going to be the next ruler. And the line of succession was determined through the mothers, actually through the aunts, the maternal aunts. The son of the maternal aunt would take possession of the chiefdom, at least in the case of the Natchez. So you have this process of these chiefdoms breaking apart, coming back together, breaking apart. They'd break apart when the political tensions or the taxes got too high. People would just pack up and head off. And that would lead to a round of political disruption that would cause people to say, our village is a little too small to protect itself. What do we do? Let's band together and form another. Well, they might not call it a chiefdom. They may call itself the true people or the real people or the human beings, because those people on the outside, those barbarians, those savages, are causing a lot of trouble. Let's get together. And you see these chiefdoms come back together. So a fusion and fission process. In come Europeans. And again, another artist's rendition of the Spanish. And this is about at the beginning of the Battle of Mobile, which is when the Mobilean Indians, probably the ancestors of either the Creeks or the Choctaws or both, really handed the Spanish back their heads. They badly defeated a Spanish army led by De Soto. And De Soto lost a lot of troops, lost a lot of equipment, but he introduced, and the Europeans who followed them, introduced a lot of really interesting precious goods. And if you think about it from a Native American perspective, think about a knife that cuts through the deer skin and never snaps, like that flint knife that would break after a few uses, or a iron awl that can pierce a buckskin time after time, not like the bone awl that breaks, or better yet, a iron or steel axe that can take down a tree in 15 minutes, as opposed to 3 or 4 days of burning down a big log and then chipping away with a stone axe. And there are some other things. These crazy Europeans take their copper. Now, copper in this time period was a really important metal for Native Americans. You'll find it all over the Southeast, as far west as Oklahoma and as far east as Virginia. And most of it came from Michigan, where I come from. And that could be worked without a forge. And it shined. It was something that was shiny. Think about that. Think about something that's shiny. Maybe the sunshine, maybe the sun glinted off the water, but this material held that interesting, that maybe perhaps sacred quality. What are the Europeans using it for? They're using it for ridiculous things, like maybe axes, or sometimes they're making money out of it, and who the heck knows what money is? They're taking this precious good. So imagine somebody making a frying pan out of platinum. So they come with all these interesting goods, and those interesting goods, as long as the Europeans don't show up, can be really, really powerful if you are a chieftain. You want to attract people, and you have some really, really prestigious items. Think of it as a Rolex or a Lexus, or, a garage full of Cadillacs. This is somebody you want to pay attention to. And for a while, the only real impact the Europeans have is the influx of trade goods until the late 1600s, and that's when we get the arrival of La Salle. And he comes down, of course, from the Great Lakes, from Michigan, into the Mississippi Basin, and encounters the Natchez. In fact, the Natchez almost wipe him out. And for these Mississippian chiefdoms, they're used to strangers showing up. They're used to people who are lost, refugees from conflicts. And for instance, I argue that to most Natchez, that La Salle probably looked, and his party probably looked more like like somebody who was lost and in need of help as he got to Natchez Country. That when he got there, there was already a fairly robust Mississippian chiefdom, and you can see this is one of the older maps that I made of the different villages that made up Natchez Country. The Grand Village, which we could think of as maybe as a capital, and some of the outlying villages. Not all of these villages were actually Natchez speakers. Some of them spoke a different type of language, perhaps a version of Tunica or Choctaw. We're not really sure. Linguists try and reconstruct the language. But they were subordinate cultures. They were newcomers. Well, we tend to look at La Salle with this rather idealized set of eyes. Here's a 19th century image of him, and they look like they just popped out of Louis XIV's court. More than likely, they look like that. Buckskins. In fact, only 23 of La Salle's party were European or of European descent. More than 36 were Native Americans, including 10 women. So they probably looked and acted more like Indians than the way we like to think of La Salle in that elaborate costume. So we get to when the Europeans actually show up and stay. Now, we have some records. Europeans come by back and forth for some time between 1680 and 1705. There was a priest, Father St. Cosime, who actually was Canadian. He lived among the Natchez for a while. And we have some really good records from him, and you can actually look them up online. The fathers of the seminary of the foreign missions maintain his letters. I've actually held them in my hand. It's pretty neat to hold a letter that was written in Natchez in 1702 and is still in existence. And I've read his letters. He complained a lot. He never really learned the language. He said it was really difficult. There were different ways for men and women to talk. So he would try and say something, and all the men would laugh at him because he was using a syntax that only women used. And then when he tried to talk about God and preach, they said, "You're using the wrong words. You're insulting our deity." So he did not last long. In fact, he didn't understand what was going on, and he constantly complained that people were walking into his house and taking things. And in Native American culture, your door should be open in most Native American cultures. And what belongs to you belongs to the community. I don't think Father St. Cosime really got that under his belt. But we also know of a family that showed up. We have no records, we don't even know their names, but there was a family that had lived among them in the early 1710s. But it's not until 1716, during what I call the hostage crisis. Jean-Baptiste Bienville, he was the erstwhile governor of Louisiana. He got demoted when Cadillac became the governor. And if you ever want to read about a shady character, Cadillac was a very shady character. Somehow he made 600 livres a year as governor of Michilimackinac up in Detroit. But he managed to ship back 28,000 livres worth of pelts, and that was just one haul. So he spent some time in the Bastille when he got back to France. But he became governor of Louisiana and sent Bienville on what looked like a suicide mission. The Natchez had killed some traders who had come down the river, and he managed to capture the great son during a diplomatic convention, hold him hostage, and he allowed the great son to go free after executing a few of the perpetrators. It actually turned out that they probably weren't the perpetrators. They were just some poor guys who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in return for the release, the French would get to build a fort right there, Fort Rosalie. And the fort's no longer there, but you can see a marker in Natchez, Mississippi. They also began in 1719 to build what they called concessions, which we would probably call a plantation. According to French law, the king owned the land, but he would concede or allow people to farm the land. Usually he would turn it over to a wealthy noble who would then bring in settlers who technically did not own the land, but they had certain rights, they had certain privileges. And what the French hoped to do was make Natchez into another Virginia. In fact, they used that term. So we don't have a lot of information about the people at first who came there. We do have some census data, but the early 1720s are a little hazy. They get more and more, come more and more into focus. We do have some pictures, some images. This is a rather crude drawing by a French lieutenant named Dumont de Montigny, Jean-Baptiste Dumont de Montigny. He was a lieutenant for like 40 years. He was a real, in Brooklyn they'd call him a nebbish. He really never got his career rolling. He did manage to be outside of Natchez during the Natchez Revolt of 1729. And these are some of the pictures that he shows, and rough translation. And the first person on the left is a sauvage or Indian with the old arms, and a young Indian with French arms. And you can see he's got a musket. And the muskets really changed everything for Native Americans. And we can see there are some women here, an older woman, and she's got a shell rattle, a younger woman. Don't want to spend too much time. I want to get to what we do know. Here is a image from the 1720s, and this was created by a man named Alexander de Botts. And it's entitled The Sauvage of Many Nations. And we can see slaves, a fox slave or an Ars slave, somebody taken from the upper Mississippi. Native Americans kept slaves. And we can see a slave here. We can also see an Attakaapa. And Attakaapa is actually a Choctaw word for cannibal. So if you're an Indian and you want the French to help you against your enemies, one of the first things the French don't like cannibals. So call your enemy a cannibal and the French are probably going to work with you. We see an African, person of African descent. We can see all kinds of different people doing different things. And I don't want to spend too much time, but you can also see French goods, European goods, very important. And the Natchez realized this, and they use it to their advantage. The same artist also created this image, and this is actually Biloxi, Mississippi, circa 1720. And I'll give you a close-up. This is a really good image. We can see that things are a little bit rougher than, say, more of the elegant depictions of colonial Mississippi and Louisiana. They're living pretty close to the earth. We can see in the background they're building a typical colonial building, but they're still pulling down the woods, they're still pulling down the trees, and doing the best they can. So we come to Natchez. Natchez for the French was a really important place. They even thought about using this as the capital for Louisiana. For one reason, it didn't flood like New Orleans. And it was pretty safe, or so they thought. And you had a Native American population that was creating a lot of food. So, I told you you're going to see a lot of maps. And what I have here is a map that was created in 1727. You might say, well, this is a little bit hard to see. But this is Natchez Country. This is Natchez. This is roughly where the bridge comes across. And I'll zoom in a little bit for you. And that is downtown or Riverside, Natchez. I'll give you a little bit. I think you can recognize that a little bit better. And we'll zoom in. But what I did was I took that GIS software, and I did this again now after sweating through a couple of midterms and watching people half my age or less than half my age, closer to a third of my age, getting up and finishing their work before I even sort of woke up. So I took this map and rubber sheeted it over the base map here. And you can even see the credits there. A lot of it comes from NASA. A lot of it is either satellite imagery or what's called Lidar, which is basically laser imagery that can strip away buildings and strip away vegetation. So I rubber sheeted that, and then I turned it around so I could read it. And then what I began to do was zoom in, and you can see here, you can't see it too well, but I'm going to show you very closely. You can start to see there are the buildings, the actual buildings, and there are names. So I was able to use a 1726 census and start matching the names. And then I went back and digitized. And I'm going to show you how this works, and then I'm going to turn it over to you because I really want your questions. I was able to digitize each one of those features, whether it was a path that I symbolized with orange, or a cart track that I symbolized with dark brown, or a French settlement here, or a homestead that I symbolized with blue. And then I took the croplands. I looked at the croplands because the author of the map, Natchez Broutin, he was a French engineer, and he was always angling for a good job, and he never really got it. He's buried somewhere in Louisiana now. We're not really sure, but he really was hoping he would be appointed chief engineer for the colony, which would have been a pretty lucrative post. But you can say, okay, how does this match to present terrain? As I strip away the 18th century map, we can see pretty much where these buildings would sit today. Now, I won't swear to it. I am about, at this projection, I'm about 99.5% accurate. And I can actually tell you why I can use that term a little bit later. But one of the places that I knew for sure was Fort Rosalie, because there's a marker there, and I was able to pin the map to that. And then I was able to stretch that map, and I found that that 1723 map was off maybe, depending on the the projection that I used, between 98.5 and 99.9% accurate. So as I zoom out, you can see St. Catherine's concession up in the upper left, Terre Blanche, or White Earth concession. We can see all of the Natchez, or all of the land that the French were growing their tobacco. They really wanted this to be France's version of Virginia. And it was looking good for a while. Again, if I strip away the 18th century map, we can see it lines up pretty well. But the other thing that Broutin did was he told us where the Indians lived. And we can see here the different villages or the different farmland that the Natchez were using. And they were growing the food. The French wanted to grow the tobacco, and the Indians grew the food. Now, there were also a lot of enslaved Africans here. I would say about 25% to 30% of the non-native population was African. And we know where some of them came from. We know that some of them came from the west coast of Africa in what's today Senegal and Gambia. The French tended to call anybody from that era Bambara, and that meant somebody from upriver. There is a Bambara nation, a Bambara ethnicity to this day. I wonder if everyone was actually Bambara, although we can be sure that some people were, because the French were pretty clear about where they kidnapped these people. So again, I keep stripping away to show you how this works. And here's the grand village of the Natchez, and you can see very faintly some pencil marks. And I could read that. It took some effort, but there are some pencil marks that tell us what those places were. For instance, the House of the Great Sun. So we actually have different evidence. Also lines up pretty well with some of the archaeological evidence. The Temple Mound was excavated, and we have found the skeletons of the Great Sun and his war chief, the Tattooed Serpent. Strip it away, and we can see it lines up pretty darn well. And this is where there's a margin of error here. At this point in this projection, it's about 10 meters out of about 3,000 to 4,000 meters. So I've got a pretty good handle. And the good people of Natchez have decided to name some of their Temple Road, Sun Court, so on and so forth. So some of the additions still carry on the traditions of the Natchez. But what this software can do is also look at this in a three-dimensional version. Again, I've mapped out and named as much as I could, but we can look at it in 3D and also see that some of this has actually fallen into the Mississippi River. The Mississippi, as I think you all know, is a river with its own mindset. So let me stop here, and I want to just show you the software in action and bring it up and just show you what it can do. And if I move into the 3D, you can see that we can zoom in, and actually I plan to animate this, and I really think, especially if I strip away the map, that Mr. Broutin did a pretty good job of doing this. So what I'd like to do now is open this up for questions. I talked a little bit more than I should have, but I really want to ask questions, see if you have questions, and if you have any ideas, because I'm going to revisit this. This is sort of Natchez Country Part 2, because I've also done this with other maps as far away as the Indian Ocean, where the French were starting to really get their mapping together and approach mapping and cartography in a way that we still use today. We still use some of their terms that were created in the late 1600s, early 1700s. So I believe Chris will will help. He'll have the microphone, so if anyone has questions, please. And there's also a live feed, so people who are watching in real time, go ahead.
Surely they wore something other than those pelvic wraps. Do they wear any kind of other clothes? And is there any sign of their dwellings or their graves remaining?
Yes, yes, and yes. Okay, first question, did they wear something other than that clothing? Yes. European clothing was really highly prized. Why? For one thing, it could be washed. For another thing, it was colorful. You know, all we have to do is look at the latest and greatest advertising, and you'll see very colorful clothes, especially for children. During the Natchez Revolt, which I didn't talk about, happened in 1729, 1730, the Natchez killed almost all of the men, but they captured almost all of the women, and women who could sew were really handy. The only two men that they spared were the tailor and the carter, the person who knew how to take care of the animals, and all the Africans. The Africans, they said, okay, you guys have, you work during the day, you have run of the land, and many Africans threw down with the Natchez when the French came back. So not only did they spare the tailor, they employed that tailor to make clothes for them. And the more gaudy the clothes, according to the French, the happier the Indians were. So they were walking around in plenty of European clothes. For the graves and the houses, we have the post holes. But we have found the graves of the great son. And we have found the graves of his family. And they were on the top of the mound, right where Le Pas du Prat and Dumont de Montigny said they would be. They matched up exactly with the historical records. So does that answer your questions?
I don't know what you told about when you said
Hold on.
Where the graves?
Let me show you. This is one of the reasons. Yeah, you asked, you don't know where the graves are. And I can show you exactly where the graves are on this map. They'll pop up here, hopefully. And I can zoom in. I'll take the roads away so you can see a little bit better. They're right here on this particular mound. And let me zoom in. And this is one of the reasons, right there, right in that mound. That's where they found them. And we know there's been some recovery of some of the buildings. And we can see here where this map was off. This is about 10 meters here. So that's about 98%, 99.9% accurate in terms of the map. So that's where the graves are. Other questions? Gentleman in the back.
Oh, boy.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, boy, do I have questions. Just context, I used to work for the National Park Service, and one of the places I used to work was Natchez. So I'm familiar with a lot of what you've got. I've got little questions like, what was the source of your Lidar data? Did you use Lidar?
Yes. Yes. Right now, Lidar data. I'm actually pulling from a server as we speak. This server is in California, and I did not use a Lidar cloud because that is overkill. We're talking, I think the cell size is like several thousand points for a 100-meter cell. I don't need that. This is Lidar coming right out of Esri. It's updated, I think, daily.
Cool. I am amazed at the degree of alignment between the historic maps that you have and the modern data that you've got for the location. I have a kind of a question. We were always under the impression that a good portion of Fort Rosalie had actually either collapsed as a result of the
of the sloughing of the loess soil and also the movement of the Mississippi River. But according to your map, it seems to me that that isn't quite the case.
You're right, okay, on both counts. So if I go, let me zoom out and zoom back in. And this is why GIS is so, this software is so valuable. And we should see Fort Rosalie pull. There's Fort Rosalie. Guess what? You're right. Now, it all depends. If you look at the marker's on top of this. But one of the first things that fell into the river, and this happened during the French period, was the priest's house. So you can think, if you're the Indians, are looking at this and saying, you're going to let your priest's house fall into the river. We put ours on top of a mound. You people really have something to learn from us. You show up, you can't feed yourself. You're really a mess. You're fighting among each other. And, come to think of it, you're like us, but maybe not so much. There's another question I saw around here. Gentleman there? Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, was there any concept of land ownership by the Natchez?
Good question. I think so. We tend to think of Native peoples as not having clear, what we would call fee simple. I own the land and I can sell it to you. Sell it fee simple. A lot of times historians will say it's usufruct. You have use of the land. So, the old story that I heard in grammar school was that Peter Minuet bought Manhattan for $24. It's a little more complex than that. But that the Indians just thought that they were renting them the land, so to speak. So, but we have on these maps places where, and in the records, where the French say this individual, not the chief, not the community, this individual native person, this individual Natchez, sold me his hut and his field. So yes, I think so. Again, the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of details as we get to the 1720s. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of these things. Also, when we look at what the way the French characterize these people, they're using terms that always don't come across in English that well. For one thing, they would call the Native American spiritual adepts, their priests, they would call them jongleurs, and it's often mistranslated as jugglers, sometimes as conjurers. But if you look at the word jongleur in early modern French, they were more like snake oil salesmen. Jongleurs were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. They were in the same class as prostitutes and actors. They could not be buried on consecrated ground. So there's like layers and layers of meaning going on in these various documents. How are we doing on time, Chris?
We've got time for a few more questions.
Okay.
Anybody has some? Charlie.
Professor, there was a loss of population among the Indians at some point, and I was wondering if the Indians caught on to that. Did they say you Europeans are killing us with your diseases, or did they ever catch on to that? Or am I wrong about the population loss?
Hard to reconstruct the population loss. In one sense, we hear that there was a catastrophic drop in native population, 90%. How do you recover that information? There's no archaeological evidence of a mass die-off. But the argument is who suffers most during, as we now know, pandemics. It's usually the older people and the very young. So you might only lose a few percent, but if you're losing them, and almost all of that percentage is concentrated in the earlier demographic. If all your babies die, and they die for 3 or 4 years in a row, you've got a gap in replacement. Do the Indians know? Well, think about it from their point of view. Here you have, and I'm sorry, I do see people who have a religious affiliation in the audience. The black robes show up, and they don't die of these diseases. And what are they telling us? We are not spiritually fit. We need their spiritual power. We are spiritually unfit. Why are we dying? These black robes, these brown robes, these gray robes, they don't die. What is happening? And a lot of them become Roman Catholics. Protestants don't do so well for a while. They don't really, there isn't a big emphasis on converting the Indians, except for the Puritans. Puritans do work pretty hard, but they expect the Indians to become English before they get baptized, whereas the Jesuits especially, they learn the native languages, and they try and put things in the framework of Native Americans. And up in Michigan, there are projects to recover. Some of the best information we have are from Jesuit priests. And the last aspect of your question is, yeah, they know something's really bad is happening, and they associate it with the Europeans, but they also, because again, these communities are very resilient. They're used to bringing in newcomers. So two things are affecting the demographics of the Southeast. One of them is the plagues, the pandemics. You know, what's left? Maybe a few dozen people of a community of several hundred. We better band together, form a new chiefdom. The other thing that's forcing people into these chiefdoms is the slave trade. The Indian slave trade, especially from Charleston, English and Scottish traders are outfitting the Choctaws, particularly the Creeks and the Chickasaws, to capture slaves in places like Mississippi or as far west as Oklahoma, bring them to Charleston, and either employ them on the plantations there or send them to the Bermudas, to the Bahamas, to places where they can't run away. So there's a slave trade moving people who are seized in Africa, bought to North America, and people seized in North America sent to the Caribbean. So there is a push factor pushing people together. These slave traders are coming. The Choctaws suffer very badly at the hands of these slave traders in the late 1600s, early 1700s. They see the French. They know the French don't like the English. Let's make friends with the French. And in fact, the French play on this and say, we're not going to sell you into slavery. So, other questions?
I'm thinking I remember at one of these history lunch learning that the mounds that we see in Mississippi were not built by the Indians we currently know, the Choctaws and Natchez and so forth, but by other Indians 1,000 years earlier. Did I misunderstand that?
No, not at all. Not at all. Very good question. Particularly because when the English, by the time the English show up, or even the French, say, who built these mounds? In many places, particularly in places like Georgia, eastern Mississippi, the old people, the ancestors, they built them. But indeed, these are non-literate cultures. And if your old people die in the pandemics, who holds the stories? Who tells the past? The people with Arctic blonde hair. You know, the older folks, they're the ones who have the history. They're the ones who keep the past alive. So they were built by people, probably if you did a genetic test and you tested a Choctaw today who lives maybe in Mississippi or Oklahoma and checked with some of the graves, you'll find there's genetic connection. Is there cultural continuity? Were there other people who moved in and have long since moved out? Absolutely. This is why I started the talk by saying that the historical judgment, the jury's always out when it comes to historical judgment. There's always something new to learn. And technology, archaeology, Lidar, they all pull together to help us recover the past just a little bit more. Okay.
We had ordered copies of George's excellent book. Haven't quite made it here yet. We got one that we'll sell to you, and we'll take orders for the others. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that you will make it to the Welty plant sale this weekend if you're interested in that. Then back here for History is Lunch next week with our friends from the Museum of Art talking about the new Great Migration exhibition coming up there. Help me now thank George Milne for this excellent program today.
Thanks.